Before dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, Paris slept under a thin veil of mist, unaware that history was already moving through its streets. While church bells remained silent and merchants still dreamed of morning trade, royal messengers fanned outward from the capital carrying sealed orders stamped with the king's authority. They were not to be opened early, they were not to be questioned. At first light, every command would unfold at once. When the knock came, it was not hesitant, it was final. Doors belonging to the Knights Templar were forced open across France in near perfect synchronization. Men who had sworn vows of poverty, obedience, and defense of Christendom were pulled from their beds and shackled before they could understand what crime they were accused of committing. Some were elderly administrators, others were seasoned warriors. All were caught off guard. The speed of the arrests was the first shock. The second was their scale. Hundreds were seized within hours, not only in Paris, but in towns and commanderies spread across the kingdom. There were no warning signs, no public accusations beforehand, no gradual tightening of scrutiny. It was as if an invisible net had been thrown overnight, one whose knots had been measured and tied long before that morning arrived. Witnesses later described confusion bordering on disbelief. The Templars had been fixtures of medieval life for generations, trusted bankers, soldiers, and custodians of sacred roots. They answered directly to the Pope, not to kings. Yet here they were, marched through streets under royal guard, stripped of their authority in a single sunrise. What unsettled observers most was not the violence, but the preparation behind it. Arrest lists were detailed. Locations were precise. Even remote outposts were targeted. This was not a spontaneous act of outrage or faith. It felt rehearsed, calculated, and patient. Someone had waited years for this moment. As the sun rose over Paris, the temple fortress fell silent. Gates closed, cells filled, and a chilling realization spread among those watching from the shadows. This was not an investigation beginning. It was a verdict being enforced. The question was no longer why the Templars were arrested, but how long the plan had been in motion before anyone noticed it at all. The silence felt carefully engineered. Once the arrests were complete, the accusations arrived fully formed, as if they had been waiting patiently for the chains to close. The Knights Templar were charged with heresy, blasphemy, idol worship, secret initiation rites, moral corruption, and unspeakable acts whispered just loudly enough to shock the faithful. It was a list designed not to be examined, but to discussed. To modern ears, the charges sound theatrical. To medieval society, they were lethal. Heresy was not merely a crime against doctrine, but against the cosmic order itself. By accusing the Templars of spitting on the cross, denying Christ, and worshiping a mysterious idol, the crown ensured that sympathy would collapse before evidence could be demanded. Yet the accusations followed an oddly familiar pattern. Forced confessions mirrored one another word for word, as though answers had been supplied in advance. Under torture, men repeated stories they had never heard before, describing rituals that no outsider had ever witnessed. Even contemporaries noticed how neat the narrative appeared, how perfectly the crimes fit the needs of the moment. Historians still struggle with this part of the story. The Templars had enemies, but not scandals. Their wealth was visible, their power undeniable, and their independence from royal control deeply resented. By framing financial seizure as moral purification, the state transformed greed into righteousness. This is where doubt creeps in. If the concern was faith, why were the charges revealed only after the arrests? If the goal was truth, why rely on pain to extract it? And if corruption, was truly widespread, why did the accusations surface only when the king's treasury was empty? The script reads too cleanly, too efficiently. Every charge served a purpose, every confession closed a loophole. Whether born of belief or desperation, the accusations functioned less like an investigation and more like a weapon, sanctified by language, sharpened by fear, and aimed with remarkable precision. Long after the trials ended, scholars would argue whether belief blinded the church, fear silenced resistance, or money dictated outcomes. But the timing still suggests piety conveniently arrived exactly when gold was needed most by powerful men. To understand why the trap snapped shut so suddenly, the story must leave the prison cells and enter the royal treasury. King Philip IV of France was powerful, ruthless, and nearly bankrupt. Years of war with England, conflicts with Flanders, and an extravagant court had drained the crown's finances. Coin was scarce, credit was exhausted, and the largest, most efficient financial institution in France was not royal at all. It belonged to the Templars. For decades, Philip had borrowed heavily from the order. They safeguarded royal funds, moved money across borders, and operated with a precision no medieval state could match. But debts have a way of turning respect into resentment. By 1307, the king did not merely owe the Templars money, he depended on them, and dependence was something Philip could not tolerate. The Pope, Clement I, stood uncomfortably between faith and force. He owed his position largely to French support and resided under the shadow of Philip's influence. While the Templars answered directly to the papacy, Clement's authority was fragile, contested, and politically compromised. Openly defending the order risked open conflict with the most powerful monarch in Europe. What followed was not a clear command, but a slow surrender. The Pope hesitated, delayed, questioned, and ultimately yielded. Papal investigations were promised, then overtaken by royal momentum. Justice did not lead events, it followed them. This is the moment where the story turns unsettling. The order's assets were seized, redistributed, or quietly absorbed. Debts vanished along with their creditors. The arrests solved a spiritual problem on the surface, but a financial one underneath. And so the uncomfortable question lingers. If this was justice, why did it so perfectly erase a king's obligations, enrich his treasury, and silence the only institution capable of demanding repayment? In the years that followed the arrests, an official story settled into the archives, clean and authoritative. The Knights Templar were investigated, tried, found guilty of grave offenses, and formally dissolved by papal decree. Property was transferred, leadership extinguished, and an order that had once shaped crusades and commerce was, on paper, erased from existence. The record appears orderly, almost comforting in its finality. Yet when historians trace that paper trail closely, the comfort fades. Documents arrive late, contradict one another, or vanish entirely. Some trial records are detailed to the point of obsession, while others are summarized in suspiciously vague language. Entire regions report outcomes without providing transcripts, names, or dates. It is not the presence of documents that unsettles scholars, but their uneven silence. Confessions appear, then disappear. Lists of seized properties are incomplete. Inventories reference items that are never accounted for again. In some places, Templars are recorded as imprisoned, yet no death, release, or transfer is ever logged. The administrative machinery that once tracked everything from livestock to candle wax suddenly loses its precision at the exact moment it matters most. Even the decree that officially dissolved the order reads less like a judgment and more like a compromise. The Pope did not declare the Templars innocent, but neither Did he fully condemn them? Instead, he suppressed the order for the sake of the church, a phrase that feels deliberately elastic, allowing uncomfortable questions to remain unanswered. This is where suspicion takes root. Bureaucracies are usually clumsy, not discreet. They leave trails, redundancies, and errors. Here, the errors lean in one direction, always toward erasure, simplification, and closure. It feels less like history unfolding naturally and more like a scene being cleared after something violent and politically dangerous has already occurred. The records tell a story, but their omissions whisper another one, suggesting that what vanished was not only an order, but parts of the truth itself. Those gaps invite a chilling possibility that survival, escape, or negotiation occurred beyond the margins of official ink, where parchment could not easily follow living men and inconvenient memories quietly removed. Despite the image of total collapse, the arrests of 1307 were never as complete as later summaries suggest. In certain regions, the king's orders moved with strange hesitation. Commanderies reported delays, confusion, or officials who arrived days too late to find anyone left to arrest. Some commanders simply vanish from the record, marked only by brief notes stating they could not be located. These absences are not dramatic in isolation. Medieval records are often messy, but the pattern becomes harder to dismiss when the same irregularities repeat across distant territories. Men who should have been easy to find were not found. Houses known to be active were listed as empty. Inventories begin confidently, then trail off, ending with vague phrases that explain nothing and resolve even less. In some cases, Templars appear to have surrendered willingly, while their brothers elsewhere disappeared without confrontation. That contrast raises a troubling question. If the arrests were meant to be secret, why did some members behave as though they had time to prepare? Horses were missing, personal effects were gone, documents that should have been present were never listed among seized materials. The most unsettling possibility is also the simplest. Someone may have spoken. A leak, a warning, or a deliberate hesitation at the local level could have given certain Templars just enough time to vanish into the countryside or seek protection elsewhere. Even a single day's notice would have been enough for trained men accustomed to travel and secrecy. This is where the narrative fractures. Official history treats these disappearances as clerical oversights, yet the scale suggests something more human and more deliberate. Orders do not dissolve instantly. Networks fray slowly, and when power shifts violently, those who sense it early often survive by leaving quietly. The missing men leave behind more than unanswered questions. They introduce motion into a story that is supposed to be static, and order cannot simply end if parts of it are already elsewhere, beyond the reach of prisons, courts, and conveniently silent parchment. The most stubborn question left in the wake of the arrests had nothing to do with heresy or ritual. It was arithmetic. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars had functioned as the financial backbone of medieval Europe, safeguarding deposits, issuing letters of credit, and moving vast sums across borders no army could safely cross. Such a system does not evaporate when its administrators are arrested. Royal agents expected to seize mountains of wealth. Instead, they found silence, partial inventories, and accounts that led nowhere. The Great Temple in Paris, rumored to hold unimaginable riches, yielded far less than anticipated. Ledgers referenced transactions that could no longer be traced. Vaults existed on paper, but not always in stone. This absence created a problem no decree could solve. An economy leaves footprints. Coins circulate. Debts echo. yet the sudden disappearance of Templar financial power feels unnaturally clean. Either the wealth was moved in advance, or it was never centralized in the way outsiders believed. Both possibilities are unsettling. If the treasure was dispersed, then the order possessed foresight and coordination at the very moment history claims it was blindsided. If it was never fully seized, then the crown's victory was incomplete, no matter how public the trials appeared. In either case, the destruction of the Templars did not destroy what they had built. This is the mystery that fuels every later theory. Men can be imprisoned, tortured, and executed. Titles can be erased. But systems survive people. Networks adapt. And money, once in motion, is extraordinarily difficult to capture. The question lingers like an unpaid debt. If the Templars vanished, why did their financial shadow continue to haunt Europe long after the fires went cold? That lingering imbalance suggests not an ending, but a transition, one hidden from courts and chronicles where wealth slipped quietly into new hands, waiting for history to stop watching in complete silence forever. When royal officials finally took control of the Paris temple, expectations were immense. This was not just another commandery, it was the symbolic and financial heart of the order in France, a fortified complex long rumored to hold riches beyond imagination. Chroniclers spoke of vaults, strong rooms, and guarded chambers where kings themselves had once deposited fortunes. If the destruction of the Templars was meant to enrich the crown, this was supposed to be the moment of reward. Instead, what greeted the king's men was deeply underwhelming. The vaults were opened, searched, cataloged, and sealed again with far less ceremony than anticipated. There was money, yes, but not the tidal wave that should have matched decades of banking, war funding, and aristocratic deposits. For an order accused of grotesque wealth, the evidence felt strangely thin. This absence immediately split interpretation. Some argued the treasure had been looted by corrupt brothers before the arrests. Others insisted the crown exaggerated expectations to mask disappointment. But a more unsettling possibility began to circulate quietly among contemporaries. What if the treasure had never been there to seize? The Templars were meticulous planners. They understood risk, contingency, and the value of decentralization. Concentrating all wealth in a single location would have violated every principle that made them successful. If danger was sensed even weeks in advance, assets could be redistributed across Europe through trusted routes and allies. The emptiness of the Paris vault did not look like panic. It looked like preparation, and preparation implies foreknowledge. The question then shifts uncomfortably. If the treasure was already gone, who moved it, when did they start, and why did the king seem so confident it would be there in the first place? That quiet disappointment echoes through history, hinting that the real loss was not gold left behind, but control over wealth that slipped away unseen. The true strength of the Templars was never stacks of coin, it was information. Long before modern banking, the order mastered something revolutionary: trust at a distance. A pilgrim could deposit money in Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem with a coded letter. A king could finance a war without transporting a single chest. This system relied on records, networks, and people who understood them intimately. When the arrests came, officials seized documents alongside men. Yet the surviving records feel incomplete, like fragments torn from a much larger system. Ledgers reference accounts that no longer exist. Correspondence hints at transactions that cannot be traced. Entire chains of financial logic abruptly stop, as though the rest of the story moved somewhere beyond reach. What troubles historians is not that records were lost, it is that the losses appear selective. Core knowledge seems to have traveled with people, not parchment. A banking system does not need buildings to function if its operators are still alive. Trust can migrate. Procedures can be replicated. Debts can be remembered, even when books are burned. This raises a deeply unsettling thought. The Templars may have lost their name, their insignia, and their legal standing, but retained their skills. If so, the order did not end. It dissolved into something quieter. Networks of former brothers could continue operating under new banners, serving new patrons, or embedding themselves within other institutions. From the outside, the Templars vanished. From the inside, their methods may have survived, ghost-like, shaping finances in ways no official chronicle would ever admit. An organization can die publicly while continuing privately, especially when its greatest asset is knowledge carried in human memory, not gold locked behind doors. As theories multiplied, attention slowly shifted away from money alone. Gold explained greed, but not fear. The intensity of the purge, the eagerness to destroy reputations, and the willingness to bend law all hinted at something more volatile. The most dangerous treasure is not heavy. It is destabilizing. The Templars controlled routes across continents, fortresses at strategic choke points, and intelligence gathered through pilgrims, merchants, and warriors. They knew who owed whom, which alliances were fragile, and where power truly flowed. In a medieval world, such knowledge was priceless and profoundly threatening. There were also whispers of maps, relics, and documents tied to sacred history. Whether exaggerated or not, belief itself carries power. If an object could legitimize or undermine authority, its mere rumored existence would justify extreme measures. Kings feared symbols almost as much as armies. What matters is not whether every relic story is true, but why they persist. The Templars frightened powerful men because they operated beyond easy control. Their wealth could be seized, but their influence was harder to capture. If the true treasure was knowledge, networks, and leverage, then no vault raid could ever recover it. That possibility reframes everything. The destruction of the order looks less like justice and more like containment, and containment suggests something escaped. Perhaps not chests of gold, but something far more enduring, carried forward quietly, waiting for a safer age to reappear under a different name. La Rochelle does not announce itself loudly in the historical record. It appears instead like a recurring shadow, briefly visible, then gone again. Each time the story of the Templars is told in full, this Atlantic port resurfaces, almost accidentally, as though history itself cannot quite let it go. Official documents mention it in passing. Legends cling to it obsessively. And somewhere between the two, uncertainty hardens into suspicion. The early 14th century, La Rochelle was not a romantic backwater. It was a strategic harbor, well-connected, commercially active, and unusually autonomous. Its loyalties were complex, its oversight imperfect, and its docks busy enough for movements to disappear into routine trade. If an arrest was a trap, this was the kind of place that offered a door left slightly ajar. Some accounts suggest Templar activity at the port shortly before the arrests, though details are frustratingly thin. Ships are mentioned without manifests. Cargo is referenced without description. Then abruptly, the trail ends. No dramatic confrontation, no recorded seizure, just silence. Historians argue over whether this silence means nothing happened, or whether it means something was deliberately left unrecorded. What makes La Rochelle unsettling is not proof, but persistence. Too many independent traditions point to the same place. Too many later writers return to it as though following a scent that refuses to fade. In a story filled with vanished men and missing wealth, a functioning port represents possibility. It turns collapse into movement, imprisonment into departure. If nothing happened there, the rumors should have died centuries ago. Instead, La Rochelle lingers as an unresolved clue, a harbor that never fully enters the courtroom of history, yet never leaves the scene of the crime either. The idea of a Templar fleet sailing into the night feels cinematic, almost too perfect. For that reason alone, historians approach it cautiously. Medieval exaggeration is common, and later centuries loved to inflate mystery into spectacle. Yet dismissing the possibility entirely creates its own problems. The Templars were not a landlocked order. They operated across the Mediterranean, supplied fortresses by sea, and protected pilgrim routes that depended on maritime transport. Ships were tools, not luxuries. Even a modest number of vessels would have been enough to move people. Documents and portable wealth, quickly and quietly. What survives in the record is frustratingly incomplete. There are references to Templar ships, but rarely specifics. No grand fleet list, no dramatic loss at sea, just hints that something existed, and then no clear explanation of where it went. Critics argue that if a fleet had escaped, someone would have noticed. Supporters counter that medieval ports saw constant movement, and secrecy did not require spectacle. The haunting truth lies between extremes. The Templars did not need armadas, they needed timing. A handful of ships crewed by loyal men and sailing under familiar commercial pretexts could vanish into routine traffic. Secrets do not require size, they require discretion. This reframes the question. The mystery is not whether the fleet was legendary or exaggerated. It is whether historians expect disappearance to look louder than it usually does. Sometimes the most effective escape leaves behind no wreckage at all, only absence and uncomfortable silence. Once movement is accepted as possible, geography takes over, and geography opens doors history struggles to close. If ships left La Rochelle, they did not sail randomly. They followed known routes toward places where protection, allies, or legal ambiguity existed. Portugal stands out immediately. The crown there showed unusual willingness to shelter former Templars under a new name. Spain offers similar complexity, fractured authority, and competing interests. Scotland, isolated from papal pressure, looms larger still, its political turmoil creating cover for outsiders to disappear into service. The Mediterranean remains another possibility, with its dense web of ports, shifting allegiances, and long familiarity with covert movement. From there, imagination stretches further, sometimes too far, into claims of distant shores and forbidden horizons. Many of those claims collapse under scrutiny, but not all deserve equal dismissal. What matters is not choosing a single destination, but recognizing the pattern. The map of possibilities aligns closely with zones of weak oversight, political necessity, or deliberate tolerance. These are not fantasies, they are practical safe houses, places where men with skills and resources could reassemble quietly. The unsettling implication is this: disappearance does not require a single refuge, it requires many. Fragmentation becomes survival. If the Templars scattered along routes they already knew, then the order did not flee as a body. It dissolved into geography itself, becoming harder to track precisely because it stopped being singular. That kind of vanishing act does not look like legend. It looks like strategy. In Portugal, the Templars did not meet the same abrupt ending that defined their fate elsewhere. While Europe watched the order collapse, Portuguese records tell a quieter, more curious story. Men once branded as heretics were suddenly reclassified, not as criminals, but as assets. Their castles were not razed, their skills were not discarded. Instead, something unprecedented occurred. The Templars changed their name and carried on. Under royal protection, the Order of Christ was established, absorbing former Templars almost seamlessly. The transformation was legal, papal, and carefully negotiated. The insignia changed, the vows were adjusted, but the men remained. So did their expertise in warfare, finance, and logistics. To outside observers, the Templars were gone. Inside Portugal, they were still very much present. This is where the story sharpens. Banned orders do not usually reappear under new banners so quickly, nor with such continuity. The speed suggests preparation, not improvisation. It implies that survival had been discussed long before the final blow fell in France. Portugal did not rescue strangers. It retained professionals it already valued. What makes this moment unsettling is its ordinariness. There was no dramatic escape, no open defiance of Rome. Everything unfolded through documents, permissions, and carefully worded decrees. The disappearance was theatrical elsewhere. Here it was administrative. If the Templars truly represented a spiritual threat, their rebirth would have been impossible. Instead, their transformation reveals something more pragmatic. Belief bent when utility demanded it. The order did not die because Portugal did not need it to die. It only needed it renamed, rebranded, and quietly continued under a symbol that made Europe comfortable enough to stop asking questions. Portugal's decision was not driven by sentiment, it was strategy. The kingdom was small, ambitious, and exposed to both Atlantic uncertainty and Iberian rivalry. It needed experienced warriors, reliable administrators, and access to capital. The former Templars offered all three, bundled into men who already understood discipline and secrecy. The political bargain was subtle. The king gained loyal servants who owed their survival to royal favor. The Pope avoided open contradiction by approving a new order rather than defending a condemned one. Europe, exhausted by scandal, accepted the fiction that the problem had been solved. Everyone benefited from pretending the past was finished. This arrangement exposes an uncomfortable truth. Bans are declarations, not erasures. They work only when enforcement is universal. In practice, enforcement bends to local necessity. Portugal did not defy Rome, it reinterpreted compliance. That distinction mattered just enough to keep the illusion intact. Former Templars were suddenly useful again, but without the political danger attached to their old name. Their properties were retained. Their ships remained active. Their networks adapted. What vanished was not function, but visibility. The dread in this story lies in its normalcy. There was no dramatic resurrection, only continuity disguised as reform. If one kingdom could do this openly, how many others managed quieter arrangements that never entered the record? The destruction of the order appears absolute only if one ignores how power actually operates. On paper, the Templars were gone. In practice, they were redistributed, folded into systems that needed them too much to let them disappear completely. As decades passed, Portugal began to look outward. Ships pushed farther into the Atlantic. Navigation improved. Financing became bolder. And historians later noticed something strange. The momentum of Portuguese exploration did not emerge from nothing. It rested on infrastructure that already understood risk, distance, and logistics. The Order of Christ, sat quietly at the center of this shift. Its members funded voyages, advised rulers, and maintained a culture comfortable with long horizons and uncertain returns. This was not the mentality of feudal isolation, it was the mentality of networks. Some dismiss the idea of Templar influence on exploration as romantic hindsight, yet the continuity is difficult to ignore. Skills do not vanish when names change. Knowledge travels with people. If the Templars had mastered movement across hostile terrain, adapting those skills to oceans would have been a natural evolution. The hook here is not conspiracy, but inheritance. Portugal's rise may not prove secret agendas, but it suggests quiet transmission. Methods refined during crusade and pilgrimage could easily be repurposed for discovery and trade. If that is true, then the Templars did not retreat into myth. They pivoted. Their final act was not disappearance, but redirection. And if their fingerprints remain embedded in the foundations of global exploration, then history has been crediting the wrong beginning, mistaking a transformation for an origin, and overlooking how an outlawed order may have helped shape the modern world from behind a legally acceptable name. In the years following 1307, Scotland existed in a state of political chaos that made it almost invisible to the reach of Rome. The kingdom was locked in a brutal struggle with England, its authority fragmented, its loyalties unstable, and its priorities brutally practical. Papal decrees carried little weight in a land where survival outweighed obedience. This instability created something rare in medieval Europe: distance from enforcement. While France moved swiftly to obey royal and ecclesiastical commands, Scotland could not afford such coordination. Its king, Robert the Bruce, was himself excommunicated. Papal authority, already strained, was functionally absent. For men seeking refuge from a Europe suddenly hostile, Scotland offered not sanctuary by invitation, but sanctuary by neglect. The appeal was strategic rather than ideological. Scotland was familiar with foreign warriors, accustomed to shifting alliances, and desperate for experienced fighters. Men arriving quietly could disappear into service, into land, into obscurity. Records already sparse due to war did not improve under pressure. This is what makes Scotland unsettling in the Templar story. It does not require secret agreements or dramatic rescues. It only requires opportunity. A place where questions were not asked because asking them was a luxury no one could afford. If one were designing a refuge beyond papal reach, it would look very much like 14th century Scotland. Not safe, not stable, but permissive in its disorder. And in that disorder, disappearance becomes not only possible, but plausible. Stories of Templars in Scotland often begin with battle. Bannockburn appears frequently with claims that armored knights rode in at a decisive moment, turning the tide. Historians remain skeptical, and for good reason. Contemporary records do not clearly support dramatic interventions by an outlawed order, yet dismissing the legends entirely creates its own problems. The claims persist with unusual consistency. They speak not just of battles, but of arrivals by sea, of men granted land, of chapels built with strange symbolism. These are not the usual flourishes of folklore. They are specific, repeated, and geographically anchored. What can be said with confidence is limited. Scotland did host foreign knights. It did absorb experienced warriors without scrutinizing their past. It did allow unconventional religious spaces to exist beyond immediate oversight. None of this proves Templar survival, but it creates fertile ground for it. The legends may exaggerate scale, but they capture something real. movement into exile, quiet integration, and the fading of identity into function. Knights do not need banners to fight. They need purpose and protection. If former Templars arrived in Scotland, they would not announce themselves. They would do what they had always done: serve, adapt, and endure. In that sense, the legends may be wrong in detail, but right in spirit. Skeptics often ask why Templar stories persist so stubbornly in Scotland. The answer may lie in the unusual density of the tradition. These are not vague myths passed down without anchor. They are tied to places, names, and practices that resist easy dismissal. Legends often exaggerate, but they also preserve memory where writing fails. When official records are silent, stories become archives. They compress events, distort timelines, and dramatize motives, but they rarely invent survival out of nothing. What troubles an historians is not that these stories exist, but that they refuse to fade despite centuries of scrutiny. Each attempt to dismiss them leaves behind unresolved residue. A chapel here, a symbol there, a document that almost says more than it should, perhaps. The simplest explanation is the most uncomfortable. Something happened that was never fully recorded. Not a grand continuation of the order, but fragments of men, knowledge and identity settling into a land that could not afford to ask questions. If that is true, then the legends endure because they point toward a truth that official history never finished suppressing. Not proof, not certainty, but survival just quiet enough to escape the fire, leaving behind echoes that still disturbed the silence. Once the arrests were complete, the machinery of confession began to turn. Templars were questioned not as witnesses, but as men already assumed guilty. The goal was not discovery, but confirmation. Interrogations followed a familiar medieval pattern, one refined over centuries of rooting out heresy, where truth was expected to surface under sufficient pressure. Torture was not applied randomly. It was systematic, calibrated, and justified as a necessary tool to save souls. Under pain, men confessed to charges that aligned neatly with expectations. They spoke of secret rituals, denied Christ, and admitted to acts that mirrored one another with unsettling precision. The language repeats across testimonies as though answers were drawn from a shared script. This uniformity is precisely what alarms historians. Independent experiences rarely produce identical confessions. Human memory fractures under stress. Stories diverge. Yet here, variation is minimal. The suffering was real, but the narrative was fixed. Even contemporaries noticed the contradiction. When torture stopped, many Templars retracted their confessions. When pain returned, guilt resurfaced. The pattern is impossible to ignore. If evidence had been overwhelming, confession would not have required agony. The unsettling thought lingers beneath every transcript. Pain did not reveal truth, it produced compliance, and compliance was enough to justify outcomes already decided. The trials appear less like an inquiry and more like a ritual of erasure, where suffering transformed accusation into record and record into historical fact. Pope Clement occupied a throne without solid ground beneath it. His authority depended on unity, and unity was already fraying. France loomed large, its king aggressive, wealthy in influence, and willing to challenge papal power directly. Clement understood that defending the Templars outright risked schism, political retaliation, and possibly the collapse of papal credibility. This placed him in an impossible position. The church was meant to arbitrate truth, yet truth threatened stability. The Pope delayed, investigated, and hesitated, but events moved faster than deliberation. Royal pressure transformed urgency into inevitability. Clement never fully condemned the order for proven heresy. Instead, he dissolved it for the sake of peace, using language carefully crafted to avoid declaring guilt, while still ending the institution. It was an act of survival, not clarity. This compromise haunted the church. By choosing stability, it surrendered moral authority over the narrative. The decision avoided open conflict, but at the cost of lingering doubt. If the church could suppress an order without definitive judgment, then power, not truth, had set the precedent. The hook remained sharp. What happens when the guardian of faith must choose between justice and survival? The answer echoes uncomfortably. Faith adapts, institutions endure, and uncertainty becomes collateral damage quietly accepted. After the flames died and the trials ended, a strange quiet settled over the historical record. Correspondence thinned, language softened. Decisions once debated became fate's accomplice. The archive did not explode with clarity. It contracted. Letters referenced discussions no longer preserved. Reports summarized outcomes without explaining reasoning. Some documents simply vanished. Others survived in fragments, carefully stripped of detail. This was not destruction in the dramatic sense. It was refinement. History can be edited without obvious erasure. By choosing what to copy, what to summarize, and what to omit, institutions shape memory while appearing neutral. The church excelled this form of silence. What deepens the mystery is scale. Editing requires authority. Someone decided what future generations would see and what they would never know. That power did not belong to jailers or interrogators. It belonged to those who controlled narrative itself. The result is a record that feels resolved yet incomplete. Questions remain unanswered, not because evidence was lacking, but because it was inconvenient. The Templars disappeared from history, not with a final explanation, but with a closing of the book mid-sentence, leaving behind gaps where certainty should have lived, and inviting suspicion to fill the space forever. The first suggestions that the Templars did not truly vanish appear quietly, almost apologetically, in later centuries. They do not emerge as bold claims, but as cautious whispers. Chroniclers hint that former brothers found ways to remain connected. Local traditions suggest groups that looked different but behaved in familiar ways. The idea is not framed as survival by defiance, but survival by adaptation from a human perspective. This is not extraordinary. When institutions are outlawed, their members rarely dissolve into nothing. They fragment, reorganize, and reappear in forms that attract less attention. Brotherhoods become fraternities. Orders become guilds. Identity narrows to function, then slowly reshapes itself around shared memory. What gives the Templar case weight is scale. These were not isolated monks. They were administrators, warriors, financiers, and diplomats trained to operate across borders. If even a fraction survived, they would possess the skills to rebuild quietly without banners or declarations. This does not require secret oaths stretching across centuries. It requires continuity of habit, trust networks, familiar rituals stripped of public meaning, a preference for discretion learned under persecution. The first whisper, then, is not that the Templars ruled the shadows. It is that they understood how to endure invisibly. In doing so, they may have left behind something less dramatic than legend, but far more difficult to disprove. Cultural afterimage, faint but persistent, shaped by men who learned that survival depended on becoming unremarkable As centuries passed, attention shifted to symbols. Crosses, seals, architecture, and ritual gestures began to be compared across time, searching for continuity. Some connections feel forced, the result of pattern hungry minds, stitching coincidence into meaning. Others are harder to dismiss. Symbols are tricky witnesses. They travel easily, borrowed by admiration as often as inheritance. A cross does not prove lineage. A ritual does not confirm descent. History is filled with imitation mistaken for survival. Yet the discomfort arises when clusters form, when symbols appear not in isolation but alongside similar organizational structures, values, and methods. When secrecy, hierarchy, and mutual recognition recur together, the explanation becomes less simple. Historians caution restraint, and rightly so. Most symbolic links dissolve under scrutiny, but a residue remains. Certain motifs reappear in places and times where coincidence alone feels insufficient. The problem is not proof, it is probability. This uncertainty fuels suspense. If every resemblance were meaningful, history would collapse into conspiracy. If none were, then human tradition would have no memory at all. The truth likely sits between extremes. Symbols tease rather than testify. They invite questions without answering them, and in the Templar story, they act less like evidence and more like echoes, reminding us that disappearance does not guarantee silence and that some ideas outlive the institutions that first carried them. The final tension in this chapter refuses resolution. If later secretive groups were not connected to the Templars, why do they resemble them so closely in structure, myth, and self-presentation? And if they were connected, why is the evidence always incomplete, suggestive, but never decisive? One explanation is imitation. The Templars became a symbol of forbidden power, and symbols attract successors. Later groups may have adopted their image to borrow legitimacy, mystery, or gravitas. In this view, resemblance is marketing, not inheritance. The other explanation is more unsettling, that fragments survived, not a continuous order, but habits, stories, and frameworks passed quietly between generations. Not enough to leave proof, but enough to leave shape. History rarely preserves the subtle. It records victories, decrees, and disasters. It struggles with continuity that operates below the threshold of attention. If something small endured, something flexible and cautious, it could persist without ever announcing itself. The uncomfortable question lingers because neither explanation fully satisfies. Borrowing alone feels too shallow. Inheritance alone feels too bold. The resemblance sits between them, unresolved, and perhaps that is the point. The Templars do not need to have survived intact, to have survived at all. Influence does not require continuity of name. Sometimes it requires only that an idea proves useful enough to be remembered, reshaped, and quietly reused, long after the world believes it safely buried. Relics occupy a strange space in history, hovering between faith and power. To the modern mind, they can feel symbolic or even quaint. But in the medieval world, they were weapons of legitimacy. A relic could sanctify a king, justify a war, or bind a population to obedience through belief. Control over such objects meant control over narrative, and narrative was everything. This is why rumors surrounding the Templars never fade quietly. Claims that they possess the Holy Grail, fragments of the true cross, or even the Ark of the Covenant are easy to dismiss as fantasy. Yet the reaction to the order suggests a level of fear that gold alone does not explain. Wealth can be taxed, seized, or replaced. Symbolic authority is far more dangerous. If the Templars had possessed something capable of challenging royal or papal legitimacy, its mere existence would have been intolerable. Proof would not be required. Belief would be enough. The intensity of the purge begins to make more sense when viewed through this lens. Accusations were designed not just to destroy the order, but to poison its credibility beyond recovery. What matters is not whether such relics were real, but whether powerful people believed they might be. Kings have always feared objects that could shift loyalty away from the crown. Holy symbols concentrate allegiance in ways armies cannot. Seen this way, the destruction of the Templars looks less like overreaction and more like preemptive containment. If even a rumor threatened the balance of power, eliminating its custodians would have seemed not only justified, but necessary. In that context, the violence feels less irrational and far more calculated. Stripped of myth, the Templars were still formidable. They controlled roads that stitched continents together, fortresses guarding choke points, and a flow of information that passed through pilgrims, merchants, and envoys. In an age before centralized states, this was power in its purest form. Their network allowed them to know things before others did, which borders were weakening, which rulers were desperate, which alliances were quietly failing. Knowledge moved faster through trusted hands than through royal courts, weighed down by ceremony. This is where the mystery becomes grounded and unsettling. You do not need forbidden relics to frighten kings. You need insight. The Templars understood logistics better than most armies. They could predict outcomes, anticipate crises, and exploit opportunity with unnerving efficiency. Information is always the most valuable currency. The order's reach meant it could influence events simply by choosing what to share and what to withhold. That kind of quiet leverage threatens any centralized authority. If the Templars vanished, that knowledge did not evaporate. It traveled with the men who had learned how to gather and interpret it. This reframes the danger. The scariest secret may not have been hidden in a vault, but embedded in human memory. The purge becomes easier to understand when viewed as an attempt to disrupt a network rather than destroy a myth. But networks are resilient. They bend, adapt, and reappear. And that possibility is far more troubling than any lost relic. Relic stories persist because they satisfy something deeper than curiosity. They offer a perfect story, one where mystery has a tangible object at its center. Humans crave such clarity, especially when history feels incomplete. It is tempting to believe the Templars guarded a single explosive secret. That belief gives shape to fear and intention to chaos. But history rarely cooperates so neatly. It is messier, quieter, and more frustrating. Acknowledging this does not weaken the mystery, it sharpens it. Even if the relics are legends, the behavior surrounding the Templars feels real. The urgency, the coordination, the silence afterward. These are not hallmarks of simple corruption or misunderstanding. The hunger for meaning fills the gaps left by missing records. Myths rush in where documents fall silent. Sometimes they exaggerate, sometimes they preserve emotional truth where factual precision is lost. The danger lies in choosing comfort over complexity. The Templars do not need a grail to justify the fear they inspired. Their real power may have been diffuse, intangible, and therefore harder to name. The FOMO sting remains sharp. If relics were only stories, why did powerful institutions behave as though something had to be erased completely? That question refuses closure. It suggests that even stripped of legend, Something about the Templars threatened stability enough to demand extreme measures, leaving history forever caught between what it knows and what it suspects. When the dust settles and the speculation is stripped away, certain conclusions remain firm. The Knights Templar were deliberately targeted, not gradually reformed or organically declined. Their suppression was political in execution, ecclesiastical in appearance, and financial in consequence. Powerful interests aligned long enough to dismantle an institution that had grown inconveniently independent. We know their assets were redistributed, not destroyed. Properties changed hands. Debts were quietly resolved. Functions once exclusive to the order were absorbed by others. The machinery of power did not pause. It reorganized. We also know the Templars did not vanish uniformly. Some were imprisoned, some executed, some absorbed into other orders, and some simply disappeared from the record. Survival occurred unevenly, shaped by geography, politics, and usefulness. Portugal has documented proof that total eradication was neither necessary nor desired everywhere. Political motives are undeniable. The timing of the arrests, the coordination, and the beneficiaries all point toward a calculated act rather than spontaneous outrage. Faith provided language. Power provided direction. These conclusions ground the story. They anchor it in evidence rather than imagination. Yet grounding does not bring comfort, it brings dissatisfaction, because what remains provable does not fully explain what happened next. The order ended, the structures collapsed, but the speed with which certain functions reappeared elsewhere suggests continuity beneath the surface. History closes the case officially, but leaves enough loose threads to make certainty feel premature. The viewer is left standing on solid ground, aware that something important still lies just beyond reach. For all that can be established, the unresolved refuses to shrink. The money problem remains the loudest silence. Vast financial operations do not simply evaporate. Ledgers reference accounts never reconciled. Wealth disappears without clear destination. Explanations exist, but none satisfy completely. The arrests were incomplete. Men slipped through nets designed to be airtight. Some regions moved too slowly. Some commanders were never found. These are not dramatic gaps, but cumulative ones, and they point toward warning, hesitation, or selective enforcement. Transitions raise further questions. How did certain skills, routes, and institutional habits survive so smoothly after the order's dissolution? How did continuity disguise itself so effectively as coincidence? And why do we see similar patterns repeating in places that benefited most from Templar absence? Then there are the documents, letters hinted at but never preserved, decisions summarized rather than explained, records edited with a careful hand. History is rarely neat, but this feels curated. The haunting truth is not that evidence is missing, it is that what remains suggests intention. The case file has fingerprints everywhere, but no confession. We can see where pressure was applied, where silence was chosen, where memory was shaped, but we cannot point to a single moment where truth is declared. That absence keeps the story alive. It resists closure. It turns history into an open question rather than a finished verdict, one that continues to provoke suspicion precisely because it almost makes sense. The simplest explanation is often dismissed because it lacks spectacle. The Templars did not need to escape together, preserve a single chain of command, or protect a unified secret. That expectation belongs to legend, not survival. What they needed was fragmentation, small groups, individual men, and transferable skills. They needed places willing to ignore questions, rulers willing to repurpose talent, and enough time for attention to drift elsewhere. That is exactly what history appears to offer. An order can die publicly while its members live on privately. Networks do not require banners. Knowledge does not require buildings. Influence does not require acknowledgement. It requires usefulness. If the Templars became useful again under new names in new contexts, then their disappearance was not a failure. It was a strategy. The world was allowed to believe they were gone because belief was cheaper than enforcement. This answer is unsettling because it is ordinary. It does not rely on relics, secret empires, or grand conspiracies. It relies on human behavior under threat. Adapt, disperse, endure. The creepiest possibility is not that the Templars survived intact, but that they dissolved so completely into the fabric of medieval society that they became invisible, not remembered as an order, but embedded as influence. In that light, the end of the Templars is not a mystery of disappearance. It is a lesson in how power learns to survive by becoming quiet, patient, and unrecognizable, leaving history to argue over shadows long after the truth has learned how to hide.